Have you ever wondered what kind of damage one line of code can do when it's written with the wrong intentions? My name is Delgado. I'm 53 years old, and until recently, I was a senior analyst at Sentricon Cyber Defense, one of the most trusted names in cybersecurity contracting for the government. Before that, I served 21 years in the Army, most of them in signal intelligence and electronic warfare. I've seen how data can protect lives, and how it can quietly destroy them. I never thought I'd spend my final working years in a place where the biggest threat wasn't outside the firewall, but sitting in the glass office down the hall. People who hired me said they wanted discipline, experience, integrity. But when I started asking questions, they called me rigid, paranoid, outdated. What happened next wasn't a disagreement about software. It was a battle for something far more dangerous: control over what people don't know is happening. If this story makes you pause, good. Stay with me. And if you've ever believed that doing the right thing still matters, then like, comment, and subscribe. Because what you're about to hear, no one inside that company ever wanted the public to know. When I left the Army at 48, I didn't have a plan beyond one simple idea: find work that still meant something. I wasn't chasing money or titles, and I wanted purpose. In the military, your compass is clear. You follow orders, but you also know why the mission matters. That clarity is addictive. Civilian life? It's murkier. My wife, Elena, passed 5 years before I retired on cancer. That kind of grief changes a man. You either shut down or sharpen. For me, it was the latter. I poured everything into raising our daughter, Naomi, and when she left for college to study computer engineering, I realized I needed to keep contributing. Not out of pride, out of responsibility. I wasn't ready to be idle. Not when I had more to offer. That's when Sentricon called. A defense contractor known for securing data for public agencies and critical infrastructure. They needed a senior compliance analyst, someone who understood chain of command, risk mitigation, and above all, discretion. I had a spotless clearance record. They made the offer the same week Naomi got her scholarship award letter. Funny how life aligns. From day one, I noticed the culture was sharp, the kind of sharp that slices both ways. Glass walls, biometric, locks, silent conference rooms. Most of the engineers were young, fast-talking, brilliant. The code they wrote could protect cities, or paralyze them. My role wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary. I reviewed anomaly logs, flagged security gaps, signed off on release protocols before client deployment. Quiet work, no headlines. But critical. What I appreciated most was the idea that I was still guarding something, just in a different uniform. Until then, I believed that cybersecurity wasn't just tech. It was philosophy, responsibility, trust. They gave me a badge, a corner desk, full systems access, and for a while I believed I'd found a place where experience was valued, where doing things by the book wasn't a liability but a strength. But belief is fragile, and in companies chasing exponential growth, it's usually the first thing to get rewritten, quietly, surgically, just like a line of code. Looking back, the red flags were there early, but when you've spent decades trained to finish the mission, you don't second-guess your own chain of command. Not until that chain starts to wrap around your throat. Jason Merrick came in like a gust of wind that didn't ask permission to enter, only expected people to adjust. He was 36, ex-Google, and newly minted as Chief Technology Officer. The board praised him as a visionary in threat architecture, someone who could scale Sentricon beyond its current model. The first time I met him, he was wearing sneakers that cost more than my monthly mortgage in El Paso, and a blazer with rolled-up sleeves like he was about to fix something with his bare hands. He introduced himself in a company-wide briefing with slides full of momentum, targets, markets, innovation cycles. I remember one sentence in particular: "Security can't be perfect, but it can be fast." I felt something in my gut twist when I heard it. Not fear, not yet. Just that instinct, honed over years in combat zones and briefing rooms. Someone was about to cut corners. Within his first month, Jason restructured the DevOps workflow. He claimed our quality assurance procedures were inhibiting iteration speed. He replaced manual validation stages with auto scripts that barely reviewed permission layers. My compliance team raised concerns about user authentication inconsistencies, especially in the new adaptive firewall product he was rushing to deploy. His response was curt. The market moves faster than the threat. On paper, nothing was illegal. In practice, everything started shifting. Critical logs weren't surfacing in the audit stream. Intrusion alerts began appearing, and then disappearing before review. I flagged it to IT security. They said it was a false positive filtering update, but I'd seen those logs, and they weren't false positives. One day I walked into a hallway conversation between two developers whispering about ghost packets during testing. They went silent when they saw me. That's when I noticed Jason had also begun holding closed-door innovation syncs with a smaller, curated group of engineers. I wasn't invited. My access to the sandbox environment had quietly been restricted, supposedly a glitch, IT told me. Still, what disturbed me wasn't the change in tools, it was the change in tone. The language had shifted from what's safe to what sells, and to people like Jason, compliance wasn't a guardrail, it was friction. I began receiving fewer invitations to briefings, fewer responses to my reports. In meetings, he'd refer to legacy mindsets as a barrier to disruption. I was the only person in that room with gray at the temples. Everyone knew what he meant. I'd seen men like him before. Young, sharp, and utterly convinced they were playing chess, while the rest of us were stuck on checkers. The problem with that mindset in cybersecurity is this. When you move fast and break things, sometimes what breaks is the truth, and sometimes the break is silent, until it starts echoing where the law begins. It started with a simple folder that wouldn't open. I was reviewing daily logs on a Tuesday evening when I tried to access a directory labeled Core Diagnostics to temp build. Nothing unusual, at least by name. But access was suddenly restricted. A system I'd reviewed countless times before now returned an error. Insufficient permissions. I flagged it to internal IT. They said the architecture had been updated, and some roles had been reclassified for security integrity. Security integrity? I'd spent a decade teaching younger analysts what that term was supposed to mean. Now I was being told it meant stay out. Over the next 2 weeks, I began noticing discrepancies. Subtle at first, but consistent. The adaptive firewall's update logs were out of sync with their deployment timestamps. Builds that supposedly passed QA were missing mandatory test records. Meanwhile, Jason had grown more public in his praise for how lean and streamlined our new development pipeline had become. Internally, the team started receiving pressure to hit client deadlines by pushing builds live without full regression testing. A few devs came to me quietly. Their words were careful, like someone walking across ice they weren't sure could. Hold. We're bypassing layers, one of them said. Stuff's going into production that hasn't been vetted. Bypassing what layers? I asked. Everything. Access logs, audit trails, even outbound filtering. I felt my stomach tighten. That was no longer just a process flaw. That was controlled erosion of protocol, which meant someone wanted it to be that way. I began tracking what I could without. Triggering alerts, packet behaviors, authentication events, server activity outside business hours. It led me to a set of anomalies tied to a dev branch named Z3 for Auto Shadow. That name didn't appear in any release documentation, but the log showed it had been merged into the adaptive firewall's core library 2 weeks earlier. The commit history was masked behind a generic system user tag, something only top-level engineers or sysadmins could execute. I brought this to Jason in a closed meeting. We've got undeclared code operating in a production-level deployment. He smiled, polite but detached. Ray, you've been in the game a long time. You know how fast threat models evolve. This isn't the military. This is adaptive technology. Adaptive doesn't mean untraceable. No, he said, standing to end the conversation. But sometimes, security needs to be smarter than the people trying to understand it. From that moment on, everything changed. My system access was throttled. I was pulled from compliance reviews and reassigned to strategic process documentation, basically a corner desk, and silence. One morning, I arrived to find my calendar cleared, my security credentials downgraded, and my presence in active development threads scrubbed. I wasn't being fired. I was being erased, and the people around me knew, not directly, but in the way they avoided eye contact, the way casual hallway greetings turned into awkward nods. A senior engineer once whispered in passing, "Be careful, Ray. You're looking in places they don't want watched." The code was evolving, but so was the silence. What scared me most wasn't that something unethical was happening. It was that no one else seemed surprised. And in cybersecurity, when people stop reacting to quiet breaches, it's because the breach isn't the exception anymore. It's the rule. The day I started taking screenshots was the day I knew I had crossed an invisible line. I wasn't trying to expose anyone, at least not at first. I was just trying to protect myself from silence, from plausible deniability, from the slow erosion of my reputation. I've spent my life operating inside systems built on accountability. But at Sentricon, accountability was something you had to manufacture and keep off the official record. I created a private directory on an encrypted external drive. Into it, I started archiving everything I couldn't unsee. Log files with deleted entries that magically reappeared under different timestamps. User access events with impossible IP origins. Code commits made from dummy accounts that didn't match any real employee credentials. I even captured internal Slack conversations, threads that started with genuine concern from engineers, only to end in silence or sudden redirection. From Jason's inner circle. One message stuck with me. "If Ray keeps digging, we'll need to handle it before this becomes a compliance issue." That wasn't a warning. That was a plan. I submitted a formal report to HR outlining the discrepancies, flagging undocumented code merges, inconsistencies in deployment logs, and potential security breaches in client environments. I kept the tone professional without accusation. Their response was coldly polite. "Thank you, Ray. Your observations have been noted. We are currently aligning our compliance procedures to support strategic flexibility." Strategic flexibility. It wasn't even a lie. It was something worse. A statement so vague, it gave them full cover to do absolutely nothing. 2 days later, I was called into a meeting with Emily Chen, the company's head of people operations. She had a file folder already open when I arrived, and a look that said the outcome had been decided before I walked in. "We've received feedback from several teams, Ray," she said gently. "There's growing concern that your communication style has become disruptive to project alignment." I didn't respond. "Just let the silence do what silence does," Emily continued. "Jason believes a formal improvement plan will help refocus your role in a way that aligns with our current goals." She slid the folder across the table. Inside was a document outlining non-compliance with collaborative culture, inappropriate skepticism toward leadership decisions, and habitual reference to legacy standards. All of it vague, all of it subjective, and all of it signed already by Jason. "I'm not signing this," I said. "You don't have to," she replied, "but you should be aware that non-cooperation may impact your employment standing. By other words, stay quiet or get out." I left the room with a copy of the document unsigned. That night I updated my private archive with everything I had: documents, screenshots, meeting notes, recorded voice memos from hallway conversations, and I began drafting something I hoped I'd never have to write. A full technical affidavit, complete with annotated logs, source references, and client risk exposure. Not for Sentricon's leadership, for federal authorities. At this point, I didn't know how far the rot had spread. But I knew one thing with certainty. Whatever was being hidden wasn't just a deviation from protocol. It was a threat to systems the public trusted, and the people in charge were betting no one would look close enough to care. It was just past 11 p.m. when I logged into the backup mirror server from home, a system that shouldn't have existed anymore, not officially. I'd set it up during my first year at Sentricon as part of a redundancy protocol that Jason later ordered deprecated. But I never shut it down completely. Something about removing layers of defense never sat right with me. The interface was clunky, outdated by our current standards, but it still held data, raw, unfiltered, untouched by the sanitizing scripts Jason's team had integrated into the live environment. I dug into the access logs for a product we called Sentricon Adaptive Secure, the crown jewel of our firewall suite, and the one Jason had pushed hardest toward deployment. I expected to find traces of irregular outbound communication. What I found went far beyond that. There, buried in system-level diagnostics, were encrypted event reports showing real-time surveillance operations being routed through the software. Not hypothetical, not simulation, actual footage, audio logs, metadata streams. But here's the twist. The endpoint wasn't government defense infrastructure. It wasn't a military asset or critical utility. It was a public school district in Colorado. K-12 institutions running outdated routers and open Wi-Fi protocols were being used as testbeds for a module labeled Sentricon Shadow. I clicked through the files, pulse tightening with each one. The software granted silent access to on-campus security cameras, classroom microphones, even teacher and student device traffic. Remote systems, untraceable, were actively monitoring them under the guise of behavioral pattern mapping. Remember whispering out loud? They're using kids as test subjects. That's when I understood. This wasn't just about selling an untested product or pushing flawed code. This was a violation of civilian privacy on a mass scale. And no one, no parent, no school board, no local IT admin had consented. I stared at the screen for a long time, torn between fury and disbelief. In my entire military career, even during Black Ops intelligence briefings, I had never seen civilian surveillance justified without national security clearance. And certainly, not without oversight. Jason's plan wasn't incompetence. It was intentional weaponization of a security product. The next morning, I returned to the office early. The parking lot was empty. The sun hadn't risen. I stood in the middle of the server room, surrounded by rows of blinking lights and cooling, fans whispering secrets. I could have ignored what I saw. Could have pretended it was above my pay grade. Could have told myself I had too much to lose. Too close to retirement, too old to be starting fights I might not win. But I kept thinking about Naomi, my daughter, about how she was only a few years older than the kids in those schools, and how, once you normalize watching people without their consent, especially young people, you've crossed a line that doesn't get erased. That night I finished my affidavit. I added the new findings. I backed up the mirror server logs to a secure USB drive, and I began writing the subject line of the email I never wanted to send. To the Office of the Inspector General, U.S. Department of Homeland Security. I've written after-action reports under fire, debriefs after missions where we lost people, intelligence summaries that shaped real-world operations. But nothing ever felt quite like the moment I hit send on that email to the Department of Homeland Security's Office of the Inspector General. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I paced my apartment like a man waiting for a storm to arrive, not sure if it would come as a knock at the door or a lightning bolt through my career. The email included everything: timestamps, internal logs, annotated code snapshots, cross-referenced access logs, camera footage IDs, and the decrypted surveillance files from the Colorado School District. I even attached a video recording of myself explaining the context, because I wanted them to hear it straight. Not just from an analyst, but from a man who had once taken an oath to defend something bigger than himself. By sunrise, I had a reply. Your report has been received. An agent will reach out shortly under formal review protocol. Do not share this information externally. Preserve all evidence. Less than 12 hours later, my Sentricon credentials were revoked. At exactly 4:17 p.m., I received a terse email from Emily Chen informing me that I was being placed on immediate administrative leave pending an internal investigation into unauthorized system access and breach of proprietary assets. The same assets they'd spent the last month hiding under modified labels and silent merges. I wasn't shocked. They didn't know what I'd shared, only that I had been somewhere I wasn't supposed to be, somewhere they thought no one would look. That Friday, I went into the office one last time to collect the few personal items I'd left behind. A photo of my daughter, a coin from my last deployment, and a worn-out notepad where I used to write quotes that reminded me why the work mattered. Jason was there, waiting. "Ray," he said, standing beside the glass conference room like nothing had changed. "I think we both know this isn't how it had to go." I didn't answer. He tried again. "You made a choice. One that could destabilize the company, undermine everything we've built." I looked at him, calm, steady. "No," I said. "I didn't make that choice. You did. I just refused to pretend it didn't happen." He exhaled sharply through his nose, the kind of sound someone makes when they realize they're not in control anymore. "I hope you understand the implications of what you've done." "I do," I said. "And I hope you understand the implications of what you didn't stop." Then I walked out. That night, I updated my affidavit one last time, documenting the retaliation, the suspension, the veiled threats. I forwarded it to DHS along with a request for legal protection under the Federal Whistleblower Act. I wasn't afraid of losing my job. At this point, the job had already left me. What I feared, more than any consequence to myself, was that this would disappear into bureaucracy, that the data would be buried, that the people responsible would shift departments, rebrand the software, and keep selling it to schools and hospitals and city councils under a new name. But I didn't know then what I know now. I wasn't the only one watching. And justice had already started to move. It was still dark when I pulled into the Sentricon parking lot the following Monday. I hadn't planned on being there. I figured, with my suspension in place, my clearance deactivated, and my name likely dragged through internal Slack threads by now, there was no reason to show up. But something told me to go. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was the soldier in me, still reporting for duty, even if I wasn't sure what uniform I was still wearing. I hadn't even stepped out of my truck when I saw them. 2 black SUVs, no logos, tinted windows, parked right beside the rear, entrance normally reserved for upper management. A woman and a man stepped out wearing plain jackets, no badges on display, but their posture said everything. They didn't walk. They assessed. Every step deliberate, every glance coordinated. I'd seen that walk before. Overseas. Before things got loud. They approached me directly. The woman extended her hand. "Mr. Ray Delgado?" "Yes." "I'm Inspector Maya Thorne. This is Inspector C. Robert Castillo. We're with the Department of Homeland Security, Office of the Inspector General. We've reviewed your report. We'd like your assistance this morning." They didn't ask if I had time. Inside, everything looked deceptively normal. Screens flickered, keyboards clicked. Someone was microwaving something in the break room, but within minutes that calm began to fracture. The agents requested full access to internal servers. They produced a sealed warrant authorizing immediate inspection, log retrieval, employee interviews, and preservation of all digital and physical records tied to the adaptive firewall deployment. The IT lead's face turned ghost white. Jason arrived at 8:13 a.m., sharp, coffee in hand, probably expecting another Monday full of strategy meetings and spin. But as soon as he stepped into the main hall and saw Inspector Thorne photographing the server room, his entire posture stiffened. "What's going on?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "We're executing a federal inspection," she said, "based on whistleblower documentation regarding unauthorized surveillance modules and unlawful client deployments." He turned to me, eyes sharp, smile gone. "You filed this?" "Told the truth," I replied. "You should try it sometime." Jason attempted damage control almost immediately, claimed the surveillance code was a misconfiguration, called it a legacy QA module accidentally deployed in a production build, but he stumbled when asked for documentation of the code review sign-offs and client consent records, because there weren't any. I knew that. They knew that. And now the investigators knew it too. Inspector Castillo cross-checked the logs I'd provided with real-time forensic data. Everything lined up. The ghost branches, the masked IPs, the camera, feeds routed through external proxies. Within 2 hours, they had printed screenshots, chain of custody logs, and server records matching my claims exactly. Then came the question that made the room go still. Was this module ever knowingly deployed to government or civilian institutions without proper consent or disclosure? Castillo asked, eyes locked on Jason. Jason didn't answer. Thorne stepped in. Let the record show the subject declined to respond. What followed was swift. Access to all product development systems was frozen. External communications were suspended. Employees were informed that federal investigators would be conducting interviews throughout the week. Those involved in core development were temporarily relieved of project duties. And just like that, the walls that once made Sentricon feel so untouchable, so impenetrable, started to feel very thin. As we walked out of the server room, Inspector Thorne turned to me and said quietly, "Your report saved lives, you understand that, right?" I didn't answer at first. I just looked around, at the glass offices, the blinking servers, the hallway where I used to be invisible. Then I nodded, because finally, I wasn't. The inspection lasted 5 days, not 5 business days, 5 relentless, round-the-clock interrogations of a system that had buried its intentions beneath layers of jargon and efficiency metrics. By the end of the week, over 40 terabytes of data had been extracted and archived for federal review. Every line of the Z3 for Auto Shadow branch was dissected, every access log traced, every deployment timestamp verified. By Wednesday, it was no longer a whisper inside Sentricon. It was a reckoning. A federal cease and desist was issued for the adaptive firewall product. Not just for the version in development, for all live instances already deployed. That included 37 institutions across 9 states, public schools, county hospitals, even a municipal water utility in Ohio. All of them had been running systems that, unbeknownst to them, had the capacity to listen, watch, and exfiltrate data without their knowledge. Jason didn't show up Thursday. The board announced his resignation by email that afternoon, along with the termination of 2 senior engineers and a corporate realignment initiative. I knew what that meant. Clean house, rebrand, pray no one remembers the name long enough to connect the dots, but this time it wouldn't fade quietly. The Department of Justice began coordinating with DHS to assess criminal liability. A separate House subcommittee on technology and privacy issued a formal request for internal communications from Sentricon's executive team during Jason's tenure. And the media caught wind within 48 hours. A lead headline on CNN read, "Cybersecurity. Firm used school districts as live test environments. Federal probe expands." That headline hit harder than any missile I'd ever tracked in the field. People were scared, rightfully so. Parents demanded answers. Local governments scrambled to secure their networks. Meanwhile, I was pulled into a series of follow-up interviews with agency attorneys and digital forensic teams. They didn't treat me like a whistleblower. They treated me like a subject matter expert. And for the first time in months, my voice wasn't just heard, it mattered. 3 weeks later, I received a call from Diane Levington, Director of Federal Cyber Compliance at the Office of Government Accountability. She said my affidavit was being used to help draft new federal guidelines on transparency in private cybersecurity contracts. And then she asked a question I didn't expect. Would you consider joining the advisory panel that will oversee contractor audits going forward? I accepted, not because I needed the job, but because I knew how rare it is to get a second chance to shape the kind of world you wish you'd worked in the first time. Naomi, my daughter, was the first person I called. I told her what had happened, what I'd said, what I'd risked. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You always taught me to speak up when something feels wrong, even if I'm the only one saying it. Looks like I learned it from the right person." A month later, she was accepted into a cybersecurity research fellowship funded by a public-private initiative designed to detect surveillance loopholes in consumer software. Her application essay started with a single sentence. My father saw what no one else wanted to admit and chose to act when silence would have been easier. I won't pretend it all ended cleanly. Sentricon laid off over 100 employees. Some were people I'd mentored, people who'd done their jobs, trusted their leadership, and paid the price for that trust. That still weighs on me. But I also know this. Had I stayed quiet, the cost would have been worse, the damage wider, the harm deeper. This wasn't just about code. It was about people, real people, whose lives and privacy were handed over without consent just because someone saw a shortcut and called it strategy. Now, every time I walk into that federal building in DC with my temporary badge and briefing notes, I remind myself, justice in cybersecurity doesn't always look like arrests or headlines. Sometimes it looks like not letting them rewrite the truth. Behind every breach is a moment when someone sees something and looks away. Ray's story reminds us that cybersecurity isn't just about firewalls, protocols, or code. It's about people. People who choose integrity when convenience is easier. People who understand that silence when you know the truth is the most dangerous vulnerability. In a world where data moves faster than accountability, where innovation sometimes trumps ethics, we need voices like Ray's. Voices that don't just spot threats in code, but recognize them in human decisions. If this story resonates with you, don't scroll past it. Let it stay with you. Let it challenge something. Leave a comment. I'd rather lose my job than my conscience. Below if you've ever stood up for what's right. Or if someone like Ray reminded you that the truth is always worth defending. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, shared, and remembered. Like, subscribe, and stay with us. Because the next story we bring you could be the one that gives someone else a voice.